Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip 20. This is a continuation of my series on moisture content. This is part 3, working with damp paper. In this video, I'll be doing an exercise much like the one I did in part 2. However, in this one, instead of using saturated paper, I'll be working with damp paper. And just as I did in part 2, I'll be working with a saturated brush, a damp brush, and a low moisture brush. And in the second part, I'll be working with a very simple small composition. Just as I did in part 2, where I was working with saturated paper, I'm going to apply a wash of clear water over this entire area. And now I've slowed this down a little bit. And if you look at the bottom of the paper, you can see a little bit of the reflection of light on the paper. That's because that paper is saturated. I'm going to zoom in. You can see that kind of sparkle glistening on the paper. That's the sign of a saturated paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this set just a little bit and dry up just till it's a damp condition. So I'm going to finish putting that swash on here, and I'm going to let it set just a little bit. I'm going to fade out, and when I come back in, I'm going to let this paper dry just a little bit. Now if I zoom in, you don't see that sparkle. What the paper has now is more of a sheen. It's not completely dry, but it's not saturated. It's in the middle there, so it's damp paper. Now, working on damp paper, I'm going to make my brush marks starting with a saturated brush. You can see it diffuses some and it has a softer edge, but it doesn't run like the saturated brush on saturated paper. So it holds its shape much better than when working on a fully saturated piece of paper. But you can tell that it will still run, it will still diffuse some, but not near as much as if you were working on saturated paper. Next, I'm going to take some of the moisture out of my brush. I'm going to load it, then take some of the moisture out. So I'll be working with a damp brush now, and so I'm applying a brush stroke with a damp brush on damp paper. Now you can see that holds its shape pretty well, but it still has a little fuzziness around the edges. Not like the loaded brush and not like a damp brush on saturated paper. So it gives somewhat of a hard edge, but it's still a little fuzzy around the edges. Now I'm taking a low moisture brush, so I've taken most of the moisture out of the brush and I've loaded it with a thicker pigment, and you can see it gives a textural quality now. Not a lot, but a little bit of a textural quality. When doing this on the saturated paper, there was enough moisture left in the paper to help level this out, but with the damp paper there's not enough moisture to offset the dryness of the brush, and you get that textural quality. So I've turned my board upside down to start the second part of this exercise, where I'm going to work with a small composition. So I'm applying clear water from that horizon line and around the building. So I'm controlling where the moisture is in my composition. This is again a very simple composition to use for this exercise, but the approach is the same as what you would use in a more complex composition. If you look at the bottom, you can see some glistening as I apply this wash, and so I'm going to let this dry just a little bit before I come in with my brush till it gets to that sheen that I talked about. So now I've got my paper to, again, what I would call damp. It has that quality where it has a sheen to the paper. So it still has moisture in it, but it's not at all saturated. And now I'm coming in with a saturated brush, however, and you can see that paint wants to run. I've turned this upside down. I'm working at about a 20-degree angle, and gravity is moving that paint, but it's moving it where I want it to. So it's not going to go into the building structure, and I'm going away from the horizon line because I've turned this upside down, so gravity's pulling away from that. And I'm just making some brush marks that kind of give the indication of a shape of distant trees for the purpose of this little composition that I have. So I've let the first wash dry, and now I'm going to come back and I'm going to wet this paper again. So I'm putting clear water over top of my previous wash. And now I'm going to let this paper dry a little bit till it gets more to a sheen instead of glistening. So I'm going to let it dry until it gets to a damp paper condition. Now my paper is at a damp condition, and I'm going to start applying paint with a damp brush. Now for this exercise, because I'm trying to make it the separation between the steps or the different brush conditions very obvious, I'm drying the first step and then coming in and doing the second step, so it's very obvious. The other thing I could have done with this is, after I put the first wash down with a saturated brush on damp paper, I could have just come back, let that dry a little bit, and come back with the damp brush on that first wash to when it was at a damp condition. So I didn't necessarily have to dry it all the way and then re-wet it. I could have just let that first wash dry just a little bit till it got to a sheen, because I was using a loaded brush, and then come in and do what I'm doing right now. But I'm trying to give a distinction between the steps, so I dried it and I put clear water on it once again. So I've turned this back around, and now I'm going to start working with a low moisture brush. So I'm going to begin by applying clear water to the shadowed side of this building, and then I'm going to come in with a low moisture brush. But first I'm going to let this dry just a little bit so that it gets to a damp condition. The paper is dried now to the point where it has a sheen to it, so I'm working with damp paper. And now I'm coming in with a low moisture brush. So I've got this loaded with pigment, but I've taken a lot of the moisture out. And you can see that as I drag this brush down, I'm getting some textural qualities to the brush stroke, because there's not enough water in the paper to compensate for the dryness in the brush. If this were saturated paper, it would start to level that out and fill in. The result, however, is a nice textural quality which fits the subject matter, because it gives the suggestion of the kind of a rough wood planks on the side of this barn structure. So for this exercise, I started with a saturated brush. You can see that the paint still wants to run some. And I moved to the damp brush, and this is all working on damp paper. So it holds its shape much better than on saturated paper. And then a low moisture brush, where it leaves a little bit of a texture, but it gives a nice shape. And over here on this composition, I have the saturated brush, the damp brush, and then the low moisture brush on the side of the structure. I'm going to drop in now the exercise from part 2, where I was working on saturated paper. And in each exercise, I was working with the same loading with a brush: a saturated brush, a damp brush, and a low moisture brush. But because of the different moisture content in the paper, I got a different result when I made the brush stroke. So you can see on the left, where I'm working on damp paper in this exercise, the brush strokes hold their shape more and have a harder edge than the brush strokes that were made when working on saturated paper. I would say that the brush marks made on the saturated paper on the right are definitely soft edge. And if you look at the left, they're not as soft, they're somewhat hard. I would just call them more a fuzzy edge than a soft edge. So that concludes this exercise where I've been working on damp paper. Look for the next video in this series, which will be working on dry paper with the same loading of the brush as part 2 and part 3. Don't forget to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor, friends and subscribers on Facebook. And if you have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page of my website, rsurowitzart.com. And if you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart, at gmail.com. Thanks for watching.